All right, good evening. It's good to see everybody again. As I was just saying to the group who comes early and we have a little chat before we start recording, this is our sixth time together. You guys, I think, at least at Westminster and Lakemont, went into a lockdown from outside vendors, at least by March the 3rd. So that first week of March, even before the NBA did their thing on the 12th. So y'all been in, I think, 11 weeks. So it's a really long time. I've really enjoyed being able to spend time with you these past 6. We will be not meeting next week. So I told Becca that, and she may have put it in the email, but I just wanted to verbally say that. Next week, we're going to be, at least right now, the plan is to take my youngest daughter back to North Carolina. So be praying for me and Kim, or lifting up good thoughts, or burn some incense, or whatever you do for us, kind of a spiritual connection. She starts an internship, which has been postponed, but is starting up at the end of May. So we're going to go for it unless we hear something different between now and next week. So then we will start up the week after that. So that would be the Thursday after Labor Day. So this is coming up is the Thursday before Labor Day, not Labor Day, Memorial Day, sorry. And so we'll be off next week. And so don't, look for an email. And then we'll, as far as I'm concerned, unless Becca tells me differently, we'll crank right back up with one more session on our topic, which is the wars of religion, which is the ending piece to a look at the Reformation. And the Reformation is, can be the ending piece of looking at the larger topic we've been in since January on the Renaissance. So that's kind of where our process is, and we're kind of making our way through. There's one more session to go through, though, that I think is necessary for us to really understand kind of what happens out of the Reformation and then kind of moving into modernity. We're right on the cusp of where most historians will break between the Middle Ages or the medieval period and the modern age. And there's a world war to kick us off, not the world war you think you know. I think I've told you this before when we've looked at some more modern 20th century topics. Now, World War I and II are misnumbered as far as I'm concerned. They're probably World War 9 and 10, or maybe 11 and 12. And if you go far enough back to the Greco-Persian War, perhaps they're World War 15 or 20. But anyway, in 1618, which we'll look at 2 weeks from now, we will jump into what I believe, at least from the modern age, our first real world war. And at the end of that is the moment when most historians would say that's the closing of the medieval period. And we'll talk about why that's true. So these 2 sessions are not just wrapping up kind of what's happening within religion or within the Reformation, but they're also wrapping up kind of this larger period that we typically look at from the moment when the Roman Empire in the West collapsed all the way through this period. So roughly 1,000 years. So I'm going to start my screen share here like we do. Let's see. How do I want to, I always forget real. Here we go. Where I want to be at. I know what I'm doing. I promise. All right, here we go. And let's see, I think I just had somebody pop in really quickly. So let me make sure I've got this over here with me. All right, just got to get myself situated. Thank you for being patient. All right. Again, as we're getting going, let me just state again for the record, for those of you on the call, you have the ability to use the chat window to type things to me if you wish. You have a participants button somewhere on your screen or your iPad. If you want to raise your hand or something like that, you can. And, as always, if you wanted to interrupt, you certainly could. And we'd stop and I'd hear your question and we'd go forward. Do realize if you speak verbally, you're on the recording then. It's not a big deal, but in case for some reason it bothered you, then you might want to just type it. Then I'll read the question out. Of course, everybody can see what you type. So where we found ourselves is trying to understand what happens from really the continuation of the Renaissance. And one of the things that I've tried to emphasize to us is that the Renaissance is this awakening, or really more correctly, reawakening of the human spirit, of the human, that the human should be able to participate in the civic government, that the human can think and process and kind of have mental capacity. And that's not just limited to some upper crust, that mental capacity, the ability to learn is something that would be available to everyone. And as we saw specifically with the Reformation, then that the individual human, excuse me again, the individual human has the ability to think for herself in how she processes spiritual matters. And so all of these three things get rolled into us moving into modernity, as I was just saying. And in the movement into modernity, one of the pieces that will play in is this kind of rise of nations as the journey that the geography has had to become more than it was, right? So let's just, again, I like to keep things simple. Think about Florida. A mere 400 years ago, actually at the time that we're talking about, there were 2 or 3 nations of people who lived on the peninsula. Lots of the peninsula was uninhabited. And then a 4th group of people, the Spanish, came and put a small little outpost on the Atlantic coast and called it St. Augustine. And then after that, or roughly, actually, you know what, at about the same time, over in the Gulf, they did the same thing in a place that we now call Pensacola. So these nations, these people, and so if you start from that period of late 1500s and go to the year 2020, what has happened on the peninsula, I'm sorry, I've got something in my throat, has morphed and changed. It's not right or wrong or good or bad or better or best. It's just what is. As a historian, we just sort of accept and look at, what is happening. And so over the continent of Europe, which you, of course, the continent of Europe, over the continent of Europe, there has been transformation that has occurred. And as I just mentioned a moment ago, 1,000 years before 1,200 years before the moment we're looking at now was a thing called the Roman Empire. So all the way through Western Europe, oh, my wife bring me some water, it's good. In what is now France was where the people of the Gallic tribes were. And that was controlled by the Romans. The Iberian Peninsula, modern day Spain, Portugal, that was controlled by the Roman Empire. East of the Rhine were Germanic tribes that were unincorporated. So all those lands have transformed over the centuries. That it's today called Spain, Portugal, France, Luxembourg, Germany is not something that has to be locked in stone. And 1,000 years from now, it may not be called those things. And it wouldn't be tragic if it's not, if it's called something else. And again, as a historian, we just say, well, this is what is. Well, that movement over time, we're looking at in slow motion right now. And what we're seeing is from the fall of the empire to this moment, the lands of Europe went from deeply consolidated in an empire to deeply decentralized into a whole myriad of places. And we noted, when we looked at Luther, we noted the fact that in Central Europe, there were roughly 200 to 300 independent autonomous units that were loosely grouped in a thing called the Holy Roman Empire, but they still were autonomous in their own minds. And so that movement to deeper consolidation, the same thing that happened on our peninsula. Eventually the Spanish get a little bit more of a foothold, but then to their north over the 1600s comes the English, another group of people. And over time, the peninsula here in Florida shifts. As I like to tell my students, when Ponce de Leon first arrived, the Seminole people were not here. There were other nations here before the Seminole people. So even the Seminoles' arrival that we know so famously here on the continent in the 17 and 1800s was a people that came to this peninsula, movement from other places. And just loosely stating, we realize that the geography, the land stays the same, but it can obviously morph over time as to who's in control. So in Europe, this movement to gain control is something we've watched happening. And we noted that at the top were a series of families. And these families are, at least initially, working to maintain control of what they would say is their family land, that they've owned it, right? And then, of course, with the Renaissance, suggesting that all people should have a role to play, have a voice in the matter, even poor people, even non-landed people, which was unheard of. Well, then this really begins to challenge the story. And as the Renaissance goes along, and then more specifically as the Reformation goes along, we find that these nameless average nobodies like me, and maybe some of you, what happens is they begin putting pressure on the organization. And we saw last time when we were looking at the religious wars or the tension in France, one of the most important points was the coming of Henry IV, who was a politique. And we also noted in England, when we had looked at the Anglican Reformation, the coming of Elizabeth I, the second daughter, the youngest daughter of Henry VIII, that she too was a politique. And these comings of these politiques becomes this moment in European history where it becomes, I think, obvious for some people that the idea of maintaining control with or for my family will become untenable. And so as you move from the 1600s into the 1700s, and then perhaps for some places into the 1800s, you're going to see that tension really grapple and build. And some of the clash will be between those leaders who get it, Elizabeth and Henry, and we'll meet another one tonight, and those who don't. And we're going to meet the most famous one tonight of, we would say, those who don't get it. And it's Philip, Charles V's son of the Habsburg family of Spain. All right, so that's kind of a precursor. That's why it says the Habsburg connection there, because the Habsburg family is certainly one of the oldest families in this story of control within the European context post-Rome, but they're the most powerful. And we had noted that when Charles V comes to the throne at the young age of 19 and then is selected as the Holy Roman Emperor, he was clearly the most powerful man in Europe. Well, his son Philip is not going to be that weak. So we'll see this tension as we go through this process kind of down the road here. So this is what we saw last time. There's Henry IV. And we noted that in 1610, now that first decade of the 1600s is going to be important for us. So just kind of lock that in the back of your mind. He too will be assassinated. But in the 20 years of his control, he's going to begin moving France on a direction. And we might at some point come back and look at what happens to France after, with Henry's leadership. And you can compare France and England as they go through the into the 1700s, because if Spain and the Habsburgs are the most powerful now, France and England are going to vie for that authority then. But we'll just leave that alone for that point. So here's the world we've seen, and you can see the letters would imply that that's a minority group. So in France, you see all those C's. I would have put an H because that's what the French Calvinists were known as the Huguenots. And so you kind of can see the story, what we've been looking at. We remember that in Germany or in Central Europe, they'd come to an uneasy peace, the Peace of Augsburg, that allowed for the Lutheran lands, all that in yellow, to be independent. The prince could decide for himself. And then all the green of this section, all here, Bohemia, Austria, I hope you can see my cursor here, Northern Italy, which is all part of the empire, could be Catholic. Remember, the Peace of Augsburg did not establish what we were going to do with the Calvinist lands, this kind of purple color. So they were kind of illegal, but from 1560 to the early 1600s, the emperor just lets it go. He doesn't press the issue. And then again, we've been looking at France. Nothing really happens in Spain and Italy. The Mediterranean lands stay happily Catholic, and the Catholic Reformation, which we looked at, I think, 3 weeks ago, was successful there. So in this time, as we noted, this is from a couple days ago, a couple classes ago, Charles V had attempted to successfully assert the dominance and fails. And so there's the Peace of Augsburg. And then in October of 55, he abdicates. He's like, I'm out. I'm tired. I think Charles is a tragic figure. I know a lot of 19-year-olds, and I would hate to see them saddled with more than they could, effectively do and lead. So he struggled. He did his best he could. He combated both the Ottomans, which are still a threat from a Habsburg's point of view, a threat to their lands and to Europe. And he had been consistently in the wars with France. Remember the Habsburg Valois Wars. And again, I love that name because it shows you, again, you and I would say that like Spain and Austria versus France. And from a geography point of view, yes, but nobody would have called it that. They understood this was a battle between these two families to control more land. And so they were going at it. And they were going at it over Italy, over control of the Pope, and just who was most powerful. I would suggest the Habsburgs are going to come out on top, at least initially. So Charles abdicates, and this gives us a time to look then at Philip. And here's how the land is split. We saw this before also. And so all the purple, and of course, don't miss this up here. Up here's the New World. Again, by this point, realize we're discovered. We're here. All the people groups, the Incas down here, the Aztecs, those smaller tribes that I mentioned over here on the peninsula, our peninsula, they're all now wrapped in. If this was more accurate, it would also note that the Brazilian part here is going to shift from being purple under his control to being, for Portugal. But as you can see down here, there's a period of time where Portugal is also going to be looped in, which we'll get to in just a minute. So he becomes the newest, most powerful man in Europe. So it's kind of an important moment for Philip. And here, it's important for you to see that what doesn't happen is Charles is unable to accomplish what I suggest he wanted to accomplish. Let me back up again, right? So Charles wants to see a way for the Habsburgs to be dominant. Now, I don't know that Charles wanted to conquer France. But if you look at this map, you can easily see how France is surrounded. Everything you can see in purple, including, remember, all this in the purple lines, and to some degree, you might as well toss in the Papal States. So really, all of Italy, all of Central Europe, no Scandinavian lands, but everything else was controlled by the Habsburg family, except for France and England. And of course, in your mind, you should say, wait a minute, didn't Charles marry his son, or didn't Philip marry Mary in England? Yes. So we'll look at that slide in a second. There's a moment where it would be everything but France. And again, I want this map just to remind you of what Charlemagne's empire had looked like. We've not talked about Charlemagne in any of our work here from a sense of teaching, so you wouldn't have seen these before. But just basically, Charlemagne takes over in the mid-700s for the Franks, and is able to basically grow and conquer. You can see all these arrows. His sons, they don't give it away. Frankish inheritance said you split everything equally. They'll later change that in Europe, because if you're the leading family member of a large empire like Charles, you wouldn't want to split that with all your kids. But at least back then, you split it evenly. And so I would argue that you could, at one level, you could trace the history of Europe even to our modern day. A lot of the noise around Brexit over the last 3 or 4 years, I would suggest is this idea that there is a consistent pull, almost magnetic pull, within Europe to return to the Roman Empire. And when Charlemagne successfully comes close, right, so he loops all this together, right, then in one sense, his namesake, Charles, because Charlemagne's not his name is well, in the German, it'd be Carlo, like my name, Carl. So Carl, Charles, Carla, all those people are named in essence after Charlemagne, because he was, Charles Magnus, right? Carolus Magnus, Charles Le Mange, right? Charles the Magnificent. So Charles V is in one sense named by the Habsburgs in honor of Charlemagne. And so I always find it very interesting to note that at this moment, when you go, to this empire, you realize Charles controlled all this land. It couldn't help, to me, but be something that he was alerted to, of how close he was to kind of building in what Charlemagne had done. Well, of course, he fails. Well, then I believe that Philip picked up that mantle. Philip becomes someone who is determined that he wanted to pull off what his dad had not pulled off. And so his eagerness to pursue what we'll see in a moment, most people see as unwise, as too strident, I think are driven behind that force, and for him to say, how do I recapture the Charlemagnic Empire? You do what Charlemagne did, which is you have one single faith and you ally yourself at some level with the Pope. If you're allied with the Pope, the argument would go, even lands you don't technically control, you can have influence over. So Philip, driven by those two things, will run his race and his journey. And what we will see is Philip is this non-politique. He never picks up on the fact that society and culture is changing underneath him. And so I would argue he becomes incapable of adapting. You know, again, Henry IV, Elizabeth, it wasn't that they just didn't care about religion. It's that they were savvy enough to pick up the world has changed. That's my take. And Henry doesn't. I mean, Philip doesn't. He's just so driven. And as you may know from many studies of revolutions, both real ones and in TV, the harder the dictator, the harder that person squeezes to try to hold tight, the more like sand through your fingers, you can't hold it together. Philip also was someone who had a rough life. As you can see there, Philip struggled. Death was kind of tied to his life. He lost everybody around him before he died. He only had a few children survive him. Married 4 times, all 4 wives died before he did. Of course, his mother and father died, but they died young, right? So he was very young when his mother died. And so then his father died 3 years after he abdicates. So Philip was, really in his 20s. I'm 55, soon to be 56. My dad's still alive. That he saw a lot of death. And I don't know how psychologically that impacted him. I wouldn't want to go down that road, but I know it did. It would have had to. There's the marriage to Mary. And I think this is also one of the important moments that we'll see kind of leading us to the Armada, because I think Philip, when he gets that marriage, at least initially, sees the political future that if he and Mary can have a son and that son can live, the son would become the heir of the whole thing, and then all he would still have to get final piece is France. So that's not going to happen for him, but I think that's going to always be driving his direction as where he's trying to go. So we know he's crowned in 56. He's only 29, so he's young. He's not too young though, so he can handle it. And he's determined to really push it. He also, I think, is challenged by what happens economically. We mentioned when we looked at the Renaissance, this was when I was coming to see you guys. I told you about one of there's many different revolutions from the Renaissance. And one of those is what we call the price revolution, which is, I think, maybe a fair way of saying the beginnings of capitalism, or the beginnings of pieces of the puzzle that will become capitalism. In short version is all that gold, remember the Pirates of the Caribbean movies, the Aztec gold, all the gold they took and silver from the land of the Incas, they brought all that back. And all that did basically was devalue current currency and cause inflation. And so that's going to play a real negative role for Philip as he's moving forward, which becomes one of the reasons why the land up here in the Low Countries becomes so very important to Philip, because it was one of the most financially successful places. And obviously, if you look at the map, you may wonder why Charles gave that to Philip rather than just keep it as part of the empire and give it to his brother Ferdinand. Part of that was because Charles had lived in the Low Countries when he was young. And even though Philip did not like the Low Countries, had not really lived there, only visited a few times, I think Charles was wanting it to stay more directly in his direct line rather than his brother's line. So, 1559, the wars between the Habsburgs and the Valois end. You remember that's at the moment when from France, from the Valois family's point of view, their tensions really begin to ratchet up. So for Philip, he's going to struggle with the Netherlands. And what this day is going to do as we work together here is we're going to be wrapping in the story of the Netherlands or the Low Countries, which today, of course, is Luxembourg, Belgium, and the Netherlands, which none of those exist at this point. Spain and England, all three areas are going to be places that are going to be wrapped in together, right? And it's because, again, of this map here. Let me go back real quick. Again, all this land gets wrapped into Spain, and England's going to get looped in because of the geopolitics. All right, I'm going to show it to you, hopefully. I'll do well. Remember, you can use the chat feature to write me a question if you want to. So when I say nations there, what I'm just wanting you to remember is that the empire was semi-independent. They all had loose allegiance to the emperor. But again, I'm backing up. The yellow was really the part the Habsburgs could directly control. But he controlled everything inside the borders. So again, all this was his control. So the point being, when I say nation, I just want to make sure you understand, don't think of them as not really independent. Each one of the noble leaders in those various areas would have seen themselves as really bowing to no one except the emperor. And then for these people, once Charles splits his control, now they have to bow to the Spanish Philip, and they don't like that. Now, had Philip been a politique, probably none of this would have happened. Remember where the Netherlands is. The geography must be understood. So this is not on the slide, but just to remind you, it's at the what I call the top of the Rhine River, kind of the mouth into the North Sea, right? And remind yourself, when we looked at the Reformation in Switzerland, the Rhine River becomes like a highway of certainly Calvinism, but Protestantism. And then when Mary came to the throne in England, I mentioned, it may have been only in passing, but I mentioned to you the fact that as she tried to turn back to Catholicism, Protestants in England fled. And where would they go? Well, they'd go to Calvin's Geneva. And so how would they get there? Down the Rhine River, largely. So not surprisingly, in the Low Countries, you get this mix. There's Anabaptist, there's Lutheran, there's Calvinist, there's still Catholic. And then these 17 places, these provinces, these nations of the empire were split by language. Roughly 2/3, you can see the line there on the little map, roughly 2/3 were where we're speaking Dutch, but the bottom 2/3 spoke Flemish and French. So there's a mixture there. You can see down here, there's Luxembourg. So Luxembourg kind of stands on the outside of this whole piece, which is one reason why it exists today. Now, arguably, it shouldn't. It should have been folded into this larger consolidation that we're watching. But geography is going to play in their favor, as is what happens here in the Netherlands. Well, Philip's determination, his determination to press for the Counter-Reformation is going to cost him not just the North, but really everything. And when you look at the conclusion of this, which happens at the same time that other war I told you about at the beginning, in 1648 happens, there's about 80 years from 1566 to 1648 in which the Dutch people see this as their 80-year war of independence. Kind of makes our, what do we have, maybe a decade, decade and a half, 2 decades if you go back to the 1760s, our 2 decades of fighting independence and really only 3 or 4 years of war, pale compared to their 80. Now, initially, Philip let his half-sister rule as regent, and she was moderate and she got it. I don't know if she was a politique, but she did not want to pick a fight. But when Philip begins to impose, he's going to run headlong into the independence-mindedness of some of the nobility. And in particular comes William of Orange. Now, I love spending time with you guys. And one reason why I love it is because I'm constantly going back, and here's one of my books that I reference for my students. And when I do stuff with you guys, I'm allowed to go a little bit deeper. We go a little slower, and I'm reminding myself and learning and looking. I jokingly tell my students, you want to know why the Netherlands athletes in the World Cup or the Olympics wear that bright, and some would say gaudy orange? Well, here's the why. You want to know the real interesting part? The of orange part, that's not actually even in the Netherlands. That's down in southern France, which was back to our boy Charlemagne, because it's all kind of connected in the process. William had been a supporter of Charles, had been a roughly almost maybe similar in age. He was younger, obviously, than Charles. Had been a general who fought in some of the wars against the French for Charles, was with Charles when Charles abdicated. He was not from southern France. He was from Nassau, which is basically due west of Luxembourg. Not due west, why did I put that? Due east into the Germanic lands on the Rhine River. I need to fix that slide. Due east. So he's from there, and the title of the Duchy of Orange, which is down in the Rhone Valley in southern France, part of the old Burgundian lands. You remember our conversation about the French Civil War, the southern part of those lands. He became entitled to. And so Charles gives him this title. But as you can see in 1559, he, by Philip, is selected to be the governor of 3 of the Dutch, the Low Country provinces, Holland, Zeeland, and Utrecht. Right? Now, William is a politique. Initially, I would say he's just disinterested. He's like, I don't care. But at the same time, as Philip begins ramping up the pressure, again, wanting to force change, William at one moment was in a meeting, basically, short version, where he was sort of given insider information about Philip's plans, not by Philip, but by a colleague. And William was shocked by this because, as you remember, the Counter-Reformation, much like we saw with Mary, and also to some degree what we've seen with the Calvinists, if we've got to use pain, if we've got to use burning at the stake, if we've got to use death, we will, to get our point across. And William was shocked by this. He's like, no, we can't do this. I don't want to do this. He was known, his little nickname is William the Silent. And it's not because he wasn't a speaker or even because he was taciturn. It was because he was, according to contemporaries, really good at staying quiet, something I probably wish I had learned long ago. And just masking. We probably would call him the poker player today. We'd probably call him William the Poker Faced today if we were given nicknames. But so because of this, he's able to kind of suss out, well, where is this going to go? In his mind, this was a bad path. So he, along with 2 other leaders, both Catholic, by the way, the Count of Egmont and the Count of Horn, and sometimes you'll see Horn spelled with two O's, so maybe it's actually the Count of Horn, but you'll find it in writings both with 1 and 2 O's. They wrote Philip saying, hey, you need to back off. And Philip instead sends an army. He dispatches one of his best generals, the Duke of Alba. This you'll also see spelled as Alva, A-L-V-A. And he shows up, builds a huge army for the time. At this time, armies of 10,000 was considered large. And so you can see at some points, he had armies upwards to 60,000 people. Now, that allowed him to largely control all the Low Countries. So everything you see here on the map, he basically had control. And just so you're understanding, I've got it marked here for you. Here's Zeeland, here's Holland, here's Utrecht. So these are the spots where William was the governor and was expected to, basically obey Alba. Well, in the process of the rebelling of the Calvinists more than anything else, they, of course, are fighting back, like rebels do, hit-and-run tactics. At one point, one of the leaders of Philip called them the beggars. Like, why should we care what these beggars want? And in a good PR move, I don't know if it was William or Egmont or Horn, but they seized on it. And so they began calling themselves the beggars. And some of these people, as you might imagine in the Netherlands, were good salesmen and sailors. And so they formed a navy. And they were known as the Sea Beggars. And so in 1572, the Sea Beggars were able to seize control of some of the key cities in Zeeland, this little city of Brielle right here. And then they actually take another city down here. And this is basically these two cities controlled the headwaters, Brielle, the headwaters of the Rhine, and then this city controlled, it's not on the map, but controlled this river here going through Antwerp. So, and because it's there, you may know that the Dutch, it's low, right? It's called the Low Countries for a reason. And you could always break the dikes and flood it. So it was really difficult for Alba to get his army in there. And so you kind of have this ongoing, battle where William and some of the survivors are able to have control over this part, but they really lost control of everything else. 1572 becomes really important, not only because the Sea of Beggars take it, but as hopefully you remember, in France, that's the year of the St. Bartholomew's Day massacre. And you may remember we talked about last time, that the leading noble who was helping the king, Charles, was Admiral Coligny, who, as you remember, was of the Montmorency family, which had lands in the northern part of France, so again on the Channel. So they were in thinking alliance with William and the Sea Beggars. But with the St. Bartholomew's Day massacre, they're not able to pull that off. But an army that large is very, very expensive, and it's difficult to control. So by 72, 73, Philip had decided maybe he needs a different strategy. Now, had he done this earlier, we have a different story, but he doesn't do it earlier. In 73, he replaces Alba, tries to, okay, I'll compromise with you people, but it's really too late. He sends a couple of different leaders up. Doesn't really matter who they are. One of them was, see this right here? It's 1571. I just kind of put this on here that his wife died, but also that they had won the Battle of Lepant, because I want you to see Philip's actually got a lot of things going on. He's not just thinking about the Netherlands, which is, you might think, why didn't he go to the Netherlands? Well, one, he didn't like it. They didn't like him. But he's trying to deal with a lot of things, and they're worried about the Ottoman Empire. This battle will be a big victory for the Habsburg family against the Ottomans. Well, one of the guys he sends to replace Alba was the successful, I guess, general or admiral, we might say. Neither do very well. What happens also is the financial challenges for the Spanish lead to the point that Alba's many, many troops, many of the mercenaries, don't get paid. And so, of course, armed people who aren't getting paid and who are mad, they take it out on everybody. And so one of the things that happens is in 1576, a large number of these soldiers will attack the city of Antwerp, basically run roughshod over it, and they'll be there for weeks, actually, before the Spanish troops will show up, official Spanish troops, and put down, this egregious kind of treatment of the citizens. But that moment will become a moment that really kickstarts the idea of, what about Dutch independence? William is still alive. He'll use this moment and call for a gathering, which will take place in the city of Ghent. And they will agree to union all of the provinces, except for Luxembourg and a few others, the ones closest to France. So there's a moment where it looks like, okay, this is going to work out for the Dutch. And had Philip been someone who was more moderate, maybe so. But Philip wasn't going to let this go. And remember also, the Low Countries were financially vital to Philip, who by this point, as we get to the 1580s, is really struggling financially for a reason we're about to see involving the English. So even though there's this moment, it doesn't work out well because the Spanish will step in, and because there is the continued differences of the geography, the history, the language, and the religion of these lands. So finally in 78, Margaret, who we saw was the regent earlier, her son, who's now we call the Duke of Parma, will arrive. And while he was a skilled military leader, he was also a skilled diplomatist. He probably was a politique in one sense. And he's able to play on these differences. And you can see down here in the yellow, unite the most southern provinces, the Catholic, the French-speaking side, basically, in what was called the Union of Arras. Well, William has to respond to that, and the upper provinces are known as the Union of Utrecht. This map suggests, now don't just ignore Liège, because that's really a whole different thing. And then Luxembourg, as I told you, is kind of running on its own journey at this point. initially you could see the Utrecht was all of this, but very quickly Parma is going to be successful in, again, militarily as well as religiously and language-wise, breaking off the southern part, so that you kind of get to a moment where right here near Zeeland and right here at the southern border of Utrecht is where you start to see different. Now, you and I would say, oh, look, there's Belgium and there's the Netherlands. Right, we know that. They wouldn't have known that at the time. But now you can begin to see why these two countries are emerging at this point. Parma presses things, and for a while, it actually looked like Philip might win in the end. They make the radical decision to declare William an outlaw, which meant you could kill him and you wouldn't get in trouble. And as you can see in 84, he is assassinated. At the very same time, Parma is successfully conquering some of the major cities like Antwerp. And so now it looks like these are going on. Elizabeth gets involved, which is going to loop us in. Most of you know where we're going. Elizabeth gets involved. She sends some troops. They're not all that helpful, but it does allow the northern provinces to kind of hold the Rhine River as a break between them and Parma. And by the time you get to the last decade, 1590s, everything kind of shifts into a Cold War position. And so they're just kind of waiting to see what happens. It's sort of like what happens in 54 in Korea, where neither side thinks the cost will be too high to go full throttle. Let's just chill. And of course, in that case, we're still in that truce, wondering what's going to happen in Korea. When they start this process in the middle, 1590 for sure, they don't know what's going to happen. It's going to be 20 years, 30 years rolling, and then this bigger conflict that I've alluded to already will play a role. Now, ultimately, the reason Philip's unsuccessful is connected to the Armada, which is really connected to financial struggles. So let's pause here for a moment and back up and pick up England and then move into this final stage. I think we can make it happen tonight without running out of time. All right, so here we go. And then here's a kind of a last map of the Low Countries, just kind of a bigger map that kind of points out different things here. And you can sort of see the differences in languages in the green. Okay, so let's go to England. Actually, I like this because remember, it's all connected. All these families were connected, right? And so you can back up to Ferdinand and Isabella, and of course you also back up to Mary and my mind is totally blank. The Holy Roman Emperor who married Mary of Burgundy. They're the ones who have the son Philip the Handsome, and then Joanna the Mad, just a whole bunch of stuff. And ultimately we get down to Charles V. There's Charles V. He, of course, marries Isabella. They have Philip. Meanwhile, over here, Charles V's aunt, we talked about this before, Catherine, she marries Mary. Now there's this happy little opportunity. It doesn't work out. When she dies, here's Elizabeth. All right, so we looked at Elizabeth when we did the Anglican faith, but now let's pick up the rest of the story. We're backing up in time just a little bit. When you look at England, it is of the major places, we would say the most wild, the most, I don't want to say uncivilized, but it hasn't progressed. Now England proper, so the central part of the island has, but Wales, Scotland, and certainly Ireland are in different categories. England, particularly once Elizabeth takes control, begins to be prosperous, and they really start getting more development, industrial development, shipping development. You, of course, know we're on the cusp of the English exploration period that are going to, leave us with Jamestown and Roanoke and the Pilgrims, and all that stuff's coming rapidly right at this moment. And so this is the England that Elizabeth takes over. And keep in your mind, right, that Philip's in the story. So Philip's looming around, right? So he had been married to Mary. Now he wasn't well liked, and he didn't even really go to England. Mary thought it was wonderful. She thought they were in a romance, and it was all purely political. When she dies and her sister comes to the throne, Philip's in there quick. And this is after his third wife had died. And so he's trying to, make a move. Elizabeth is one of my favorite, if not my very favorite, European leader. She's certainly in my top 5 of most successful European leaders. If you're going to go back in history and find somebody to help us in our current scenario, she'd be my go-to. She'd be the person I'd bring up first, her, and then maybe I'll tell you. But she was smart and savvy. And when you really realize how masculine, patriarchal, we might say, the world was, for her to be that successful wasn't flukish. It wasn't because she's just a dummy and people took care of her. She did have good advisors and successful men around her, but she ran the show. Do not ever fall prey to any suggestion that somehow she was a puppet for someone. Elizabeth was a wonderful person. I tell my students all the time, both the girls and the men, that you want to be a good leader in business, you should study Elizabeth's life, because she was not necessarily well liked. She was running against a system that would have naturally opposed her and kind of thwarted her, disregarded her. She came into a dicey situation religiously as well as geopolitically, and her company, if you want to use that term, was not well off. As I've showed you in other slides before, of all the players in Europe, England was backwards. There were Germanic states like Saxony who arguably had more power and wealth than England did. So, for her to pull off what she pulls off, I think just shows her quality. And she was someone who also quickly realizes she can't just be thinking about her family or trying to raise a family. She knew she was considered to be fairly attractive. She used that to her advantage. It's not just women who use sexuality as a tool. We know that from a lot of different stories, and not all of them are good stories, but certainly she understood. And as a man, I think I could say this well, that lots of times men don't always think with their brains, and they get sidetracked pretty quickly sometimes with an attractive woman who can use that to her advantage. And Elizabeth was really strong at this process. She was patient. She saw what had happened with Mary and knew she couldn't go down that road. And we, of course, already covered this, that she was determined to, to basically keep it blended. And she went back to where her dad had been. She wasn't going to be overly Protestant like her brother Edward had been. She wasn't going to pursue a Catholic position. Mary, of course, had replaced many of the clergy in the country with Catholics, not surprisingly. Mary doesn't banish them. She doesn't kill them. She doesn't run them off. She basically quietly says, look, this is what we're going to do, and you can stay. You just have to become willing to accept the act of supremacy, which means I'm in charge as the governor, and these articles of faith. And many of them do. And she accepts them, and we go happily down the road, which again is why I said, not trying to mock anybody who's Anglican or Episcopalian, but to me, the Episcopalian Anglican faith is basically Catholic light. It's everything Catholic but the Pope. Everything else, all the bells and smells and whistles and robes and seasons and things that the Christians in that group does. And so it's a lot of the similarities, and you kind of get that flavor there where you've got many Catholic priests, in essence, renouncing the papacy, but to keep their jobs and to keep their lives. She's frugal. She recognized they weren't well off, they weren't rich. Now, she wasn't afraid to let her many suitors buy her things, but she was not spending money herself. She believed ultimately that she was going to be wedded to England, which is why she was able to, at least for a long time in her life, continue to offer marriage as a lure for things that she wanted, even though she was determined to, as she often said, stay married. I have one husband, I have one mate. It's England itself. So into the story comes her foil. There's been a recent movie. I didn't see the movie, but is at this juncture of Counter-Reformation. Both Philip and Counter-Reformation leaders are thinking, how can we get rid of Elizabeth? And who do we replace her with? Well, the nearest relative was Mary, and who goes down in the moniker Mary, Queen of Scots. She actually was one of the people, you may remember on the slide, of the Valois family. She was married to one of the final people of the Valois family, Francis. When he dies, she goes back to Scotland. She runs the show. Mary was more attractive, according to contemporary sources, than Elizabeth. She would be, as the young people say, hot or sexy, and she knew it. And not to be demeaning, but where Elizabeth knew she was attractive and knew how to use that to her advantage, but was very intelligent and savvy, Mary was not intelligent and savvy. I don't want to call her a dumb blonde, that's not fair, but she certainly was someone who knew she was sexy, but she often became the person getting played in the story, and she was not careful. And in the game of politics, as many of you know, you got to be super careful. Careful what you say, careful how you look, careful how you present yourself. And Mary didn't. And she was going to be a tool for people to try to get rid of Elizabeth. And Elizabeth saw it. She knew all of it. Eventually, Mary will get herself in trouble with the Scottish nobility and will flee and come down to London to be in Elizabeth's court. Elizabeth will basically promptly throw her in prison. Not in prison, but she basically is under guard. So when she gets to London, she's not free. And Mary becomes one of several challenges Elizabeth will have to play her hand at. One is Philip. So Philip is rebuffed in this marriage proposal, and he doesn't like it. And so he kind of loses the ability to take England through marriage and then secession. Then there's also going to be challenges for Elizabeth from the religious side of the story, in that both the Catholics, is that on this slide? Did I miss this? Yeah, the Catholics are going to be wanting to get rid of her, as I already mentioned, but I also want to make sure I focus right here. If you remember our conversation about the start of the American Revolution, which was, January of a year and a half ago or so, the Puritans play a story. Well, this is when the Puritans emerge in English story. They're English Protestants who fled from Mary's persecution, and they would have gone down to Geneva. And what they would have seen is that, wow, look what these guys are doing for their protest. And of course, you may remember Calvin's written the Institutes, which I told you was the elite book of theology for the Protestants. So here come this English people who've had a very tepid, sort of reform. They get taught by Calvin and in Geneva. And then when Elizabeth comes to the throne, they go home. Well, what do they bring with them? They bring with them this passion of Calvinism, which, as you remember, is the most militant, the most activist of the Protestant groups. So they come to England and they want to do that stuff. And it's here that they get their moniker under Elizabeth of Puritan, because they were accused, you're just trying to purify the faith. And of course, Elizabeth's like, yeah, we're not going there, because she's trying to let the dust settle. Let's just be calm. We don't want to get into all that. And if you want to go have your own little Puritan church somewhere, fine, I don't care. But don't think you're going to change the whole system. But to the Puritans, most activists, right, that's not good enough. They'll take that nickname and kind of carry it with them. So you got Catholics, you got Calvinists, you've got Mary, and you got Philip putting all this pressure on Elizabeth. And when Mary arrives, the Jesuits will step up their attempts to kill Elizabeth. And this is going to be part of Philip's game. Not that Philip paid for them to do this, but there's this sense of where you kind of see Philip pressing behind the scenes, trying to figure this out. How can I get rid? Because if he could get Mary on the throne, she would accept his proposal for marriage. And for him, I'm back in the driver's seat. We can make this happen. So there's these tensions happening, largely centered around religion, centered around economics, and centered around Philip's passion to try to pull off, as we said, this recapturing of Europe. In 1586, Mary goes one step too far. And even though Elizabeth did not want this to happen, the evidence is clear, and so she is executed. Elizabeth didn't want to do that because she knew where this would go, which would be Philip being ticked off, and the Catholics, who were the ultra-conservative Catholics, being even more angry, which they were. And so for Philip, this is it. So around that time, he has his lead admiral construct a strategy. How can we invade England? Now, if you know your English history, this is one of the great stories, one of the great mysteries from English history is how freaking difficult it is to invade an island. Hitler's going to find it out. Napoleon's going to find it out. The only ones who really pull it off are the Vikings and William. Others are going to try. They're not going to make it happen. And so he's got an idea. Remember, he's got a massive army up in the Low Countries, just across the channel. It's short. If he could get enough ships to the Low Country, he could pick up Parma's army and just go scooch sideways. He didn't have to do anything massive. Build enough ships, you could almost make like a wooden bridge. So the plan was to build about 300 ships. They don't get to 300, they get to about 150. They're not helped, as you can see, when Sir Francis Drake, the English know it's coming, everybody knows it's coming. And so Drake surprises them, sails into Cadiz, and sinks a bunch of ships, damages ships. Spain's run out of money. Eventually, Philip's like, we got to make this happen. We got to get going. So they finally do. They get some more ships that arrive in the spring of 88 from Portugal, from the New World. On the 12th, they finally leave the peninsula, 12th of July. It's a massive fleet for the time. It's not the one they wanted, but it's pretty freaking big. It's interesting when you study this from a naval history point of view, which we're just not going to go that deep into it. You can watch how the two nations have different fighting strategies. You may have been to the Mediterranean before, and the Mediterranean is sort of like a big lake. It's not really, but it's got tides, but it's really not considered stormy, right? And of course, you also probably know the North Sea is considered one of the worst, most stormy bodies of water because of that region of the world where the jet stream comes over and it just, it's cold and stormy and this kind of thing. So they had different fighting styles. For the Spanish, they built massive, massive ships, maybe the largest, except for some ships built by the Chinese a couple of years, 100 years before. But these are big, big ships that both are transport and fighting ships, which were perfect for ramming into each other and then, having Marines hop on each other's ships and fighting and killing and taking over the ship. The British, however, by being up in the North Sea and the Channel has consistent winds that are almost always going this way. So for a ship to be able to sail both directions, it has to be nimble. And I'm not a sailor, my wife is, she can tell you more about it, but you've got to be able to tack into the wind, and it's really difficult. And so the channel is narrow for, relatively speaking, it's not big, right? And so, you want to go the other direction against the wind, you've got to be able to move rapidly. You can't be taking 5-mile turns and have a chance to make it. Not with a big fleet. Maybe one ship could pull that off, but not with a big fleet. So the Spanish fleet is showing up, and they begin sailing through the channel like a big arc, like a crescent. And because they're really, to some degree, just wanting to build a big bridge. They're not really planning on sailing and invading England. They're kind of just going to land in the Netherlands and kind of scooch over, right? And their plan was to land right here at Calais, the very place Hitler thought our invasion would come because it's the closest. So, if you're Spain, you pick up people in Calais and you scooch to the left and you're there near Dover, done, right? You may pull that off. The British could sail around them. What was interesting is neither fleet could really hurt the other. The Spanish did not have the best marksmen with their cannons, and the British ships were really too fast. The British could hit those Spanish ships, but they were so big, they had a very difficult time sinking them. The British actually have a fleet that's similar in size. They're able to put out as many, in some estimates, actually a few more ships, but their ships are tiny, right? So it's not as big of a deal. Here's a better map. That's a closer map. When they get to Calais, they make it. They've only lost a few ships. Parma's not there. So, oh my gosh, the admiral's freaking out because the British are all over them, right? And what had happened was that Parma, because remember, he's in this moment where he's still fighting. He'd only taken Antwerp 3 years before, right? Leaving, he doesn't want the forces of the north, of the Utrecht alliance, to be able to just march into the south when his army's gone. So he's trying to pull a fast one. And he does. He pulls it off. The Dutch people never really knew the plan, but he misses the deadline. Now, in a normal setting, no big deal. You're 2 days late. It's okay. We'll arrive. But in a setting where the Spanish army is being confronted Spanish Navy by the British Navy, that's not good enough. The British sort of figure out what's happening. And so they come up with a pretty drastic plan. As you can see there, on the night of the 7th, they lit 8 ships on fire and sent them into the formation, basically forcing the Spanish ships to split apart and separate. Gone is the idea of the bridge, gone is the formation. And now the more nimble British ships could surround individual Spanish ships and really get after them. And they do, but what really kills the Spanish is once they make this, once this happens, you see on this map here, how they now slide out from underneath the bottom part of the island where the channel is. And at that moment, a massive storm rolled up on the 8th and 9th, and it scatters the Spanish fleet. Well, again, as I told you, they're too big to go back through the channel. Worse, in the Battle of Gravelines, everybody ran out of ammunition and materials. The British just went back to port, right? They go to Plymouth and Portland and Portsmouth and up to Thames, right? And it was easier for them to get resupplied. The Spanish, that couldn't happen. So their only choice was to go around Scotland, which was a nightmare. And when it was all over half the fleet, they probably lost more ships over here on the west coast of Ireland than they did to any British attack. And by the end, they'd lost over half of their navy. This moment not only allows the Dutch to hold that line on the Rhine River and force Parma and the Spanish into this uneasy truce because they're just kind of out of gas. But it's really the moment when Spain begins her slow decline out of first place and slowly slides down. And of course, as you know, we're 1588, we're right here on the cusp of what is the coming of both France and England as they make their way forward. So the wars of religion are not done yet. I already warned you, we've got this problem coming, a 30-year conflict, which will be the last blow, which we'll look at next time. But it is really this ending moment where you sort of can say, well, what's going on? You've got England on the precipice of a dynamic century that'll be led by a new family, the Stuart family. The Jesuits and the Calvinists are both energized, even more so because of what's happened in the Netherlands and in England. The Calvinists in particular are determined to not be left out of the equation in Central Europe. And as you noticed, in the early 1600s, a lot of things happen. Elizabeth dies, Henry IV is assassinated, the truce kind of settles in for the Dutch. It's not really clear what's happening in the whole process. And so we find ourselves looking at that second decade of the 1600s, and maybe sort of like what we've just lived through in our own second decade, if you're paying attention, you knew something's coming. You just like, I don't know what it is. I don't know where we're going, but man, things feel a little intense. And in 1618, we'll see it happen. And so that's where we'll stop tonight. And that's where we'll pick it up for next time. Again, I appreciate you guys so, so much. I want to make sure I say one more time for those who came in maybe a little later, we will not be meeting next week. I will not be here next week. We're going to be taking our daughter to North Carolina. So we'll be gone. So our next time, and I'll make sure Becca gets the information, will be the Thursday after Memorial Day. So I hope you have a wonderful Memorial Day in some sense, even though we're going through hard times. It's a time, it's one of our national celebrations, and both in thought and in memory of those who served the country, but also sort of the kickoff to summer. And obviously it's a very, very different year, the most, different, certainly our national history and maybe in world history. But at the same time, we're alive, we're here, you're there, and we're healthy, and we're trying to stay healthy. And so let's have good thoughts. And I don't know if I have a hot dog or not, but we'll try to have some celebration. Hopefully Westminster will do something fun for you guys. I'll pause for a second, see if there's any last minute questions from anybody who wants to. Nobody's typed anything in the chat, which is fine. I'll pause for a second. I appreciate you guys. Have a wonderful, wonderful night. It's good to see some of your faces. Thank you so much. Bye-bye. Good night.